Why are the Balkans consistently ranked among the most corrupt regions in Europe? Why do countries with ancient civilizations, deep cultural traditions, and generations of talented people struggle so deeply with weak institutions, political scandals, and broken trust? Is corruption in the Balkans a cultural flaw? Or is something far deeper at work? Because here is an uncomfortable truth. People in the Balkans are not more immoral than people elsewhere. They fall in love, they raise families, they dream of stable lives, just like everyone else, yet their states often fail them. And this documentary is not about blaming nations. It is about understanding systems, about tracing the long chain of history that shaped how power works in this region. Because corruption is not born in a vacuum. It grows where institutions are weak, where trauma is inherited, and where survival once depended on bending the rules. To understand corruption in the Balkans, we must go back centuries. The Balkans sit at one of the most violent crossroads in human history. For thousands of years, this region has been a bridge between worlds: Europe and Asia, Christianity and Islam, empires rising and collapsing, Romans, Byzantines, Ottomans, Austro-Hungarians, Nazis, Communists. Few regions on Earth have been conquered so many times, and constant conquest leaves scars. In stable regions, states evolve slowly. Laws mature, institutions harden, trust develops over generations. But in the Balkans, states rarely lasted long enough to mature. Borders shifted, rulers changed, loyalty was dangerous, so people learned a different lesson. Do not trust the state. Do not rely on institutions, rely on family, rely on clan, rely on yourself. This survival instinct did not disappear with time. It became cultural memory, passed quietly from generation to generation, not as ideology, but as instinct. For centuries, most Balkan societies lived under foreign empires. The Ottoman Empire ruled much of the region for nearly 500 years. Later, the Austro-Hungarian Empire controlled large sections. These were not participatory states. Local populations did not view government as their government. The state was an occupying force, tax collector, conscription machine, punisher, not a service provider, not a protector. Under such systems, honesty toward the state made little sense. If the empire takes from you, you take back when you can. Bribery became survival. Connections became shields. Rules became obstacles. The smartest people were not those who followed the law. They were the ones who learned how to bypass it. Over centuries, this mentality hardened. The state is not us. The state is them. And when modern Balkan nations finally gained independence, they inherited borders, they inherited flags, but they did not inherit strong institutional traditions. They inherited something else, a deeply rooted suspicion toward authority. In Greek history, there is a revealing example. The Klefts and Armatoli, men who lived in the mountains during Ottoman rule. Sometimes they were bandits, sometimes guerrilla fighters, sometimes protectors of villages, sometimes collaborators with the empire, often all of the above. They robbed Ottoman authorities, but they also extorted locals. They fought oppression, but they also made deals with it. They existed in a grey zone, not fully criminal, not fully lawful. Survival required flexibility. Loyalty shifted depending on circumstances. This pattern was not unique to Greece. Across the Balkans, similar figures existed. People who survived between legality and illegality, between resistance and cooperation. And this created something crucial, a long tradition of moral ambiguity toward authority. Breaking the law was not always seen as wrong. Sometimes it was seen as clever, sometimes even heroic. This mentality did not disappear with independence. It simply adapted. Western Europe followed a different historical path. Magna Carta in England, the Enlightenment in France and Germany, the slow rise of constitutional government. Power was gradually constrained. Kings were challenged. Courts gained independence. Property rights were protected. This process took centuries, but it created something priceless. The idea that the state belongs to the people. In the Balkans, the opposite experience dominated. Power always came from above, not from citizens, from sultans, emperors, party bosses, military strongmen. As a result, many Western societies developed rule of law. Balkan societies developed rule of relationships. Who you know matters more than what the law says. This is not a moral failure. It is a historical inheritance. In Western Europe, corruption is a scandal. In the Balkans, it is sometimes a strategy. But history alone does not explain everything, because in the 20th century, a new system arrived, one that promised equality and delivered a different kind of corruption: communism. After World War II, much of the Balkans fell behind the Iron Curtain. Private property was abolished. Industries were nationalized. The state became the sole employer. In theory, this system promised fairness. In reality, it produced scarcity. Shops were empty, salaries were low, bureaucracy was overwhelming, and yet people still needed to survive. So, a parallel system emerged: an informal economy, black markets, under-the-table payments, personal favors. If you wanted a better apartment, you needed connections. If you wanted a university position, you needed party approval. If you wanted a business license, you needed to thank the right official. Corruption was no longer an exception. It became infrastructure. Children grew up watching their parents navigate the system not through law, but through networks. And over time, something dangerous happened. Corruption stopped feeling immoral. It started feeling normal, not heroic, not shameful, just normal. The collapse of communism did not bring immediate freedom. It brought chaos. Nowhere was this more visible than in the wars of the 1990s. Yugoslavia disintegrated. States collapsed overnight. Sanctions were imposed. Borders hardened. Formal economies died. But war creates opportunity. Smuggling networks flourished. Fuel, weapons, cigarettes, drugs, human trafficking. A new elite was born. Not through innovation, not through entrepreneurship, but through violence and connections. These wartime networks did not disappear after peace agreements. They entered politics. They entered business. They became respectable. Suits replaced uniforms. But the mindset remained. Power was something to be captured, not something to be regulated. Across the Balkans, state assets were privatized. Factories, mines, energy companies, telecommunications. In theory, this was meant to create capitalism. In practice, it often created oligarchy. Companies worth hundreds of millions were sold for pennies, to friends of politicians, to former party officials, to people with the right connections. Workers lost jobs, communities collapsed, a small group became extremely wealthy, and ordinary citizens watched something devastating. Theft had become legal. When a society witnesses legalized theft, trust dies. People stop believing that playing fair has value. And when fairness feels pointless, corruption becomes rational. History explains mentality. Communism explains normalization. War explains criminalization. But corruption today is not abstract. It has names, cases, documents, court files. Let's look at what this system actually produces. Real scandals, real countries, real consequences. Corruption in the Balkans is not theoretical, it is documented, it is measurable, and it has names. Let's look at a few examples, not to single out nations, but to reveal patterns. In the early 2000s, German multinational Siemens admitted to running a massive global bribery scheme. Greece became one of its most notorious cases. Millions of euros were funneled to Greek politicians and officials in exchange for contracts involving telecommunications, Olympic security systems, and major public infrastructure. Investigations confirmed widespread bribery, yet only a handful of people faced serious consequences. Several suspects fled abroad. The message was clear. Even when corruption is exposed, punishment is optional. Romanian officials accepted bribes in exchange for overpriced software contracts with Microsoft. Ministers, prime ministers, senior bureaucrats. The damage exceeded 1 billion euros. But Romania surprised many observers. High-ranking officials were prosecuted, some went to prison. It was proof that improvement is possible, but also proof of how deep the rot had become. European reports have repeatedly warned that Bulgaria suffers from state capture, a situation where political power, organized crime, and business interests merge. Public contracts go to the same companies. Media ownership is concentrated. Judges face pressure. In such systems, corruption is not a side effect, it is the operating system. After the 1990s wars, Serbia privatized state enterprises. Many were sold far below market value. To politically connected buyers, factories closed, workers lost jobs, new owners grew rich. The transition to capitalism became a transfer of wealth to insiders. For years, Albania was described as a major cannabis producer in Europe. Investigations linked criminal networks with local authorities, police protection, political cover. When illegal economies become normalized, legality becomes optional. Croatia's former prime minister was convicted of corruption and abuse of power. It was a rare moment of accountability, and a reminder: corruption reaches the very top. Thousands of illegal wiretaps were revealed. Journalists, judges, political opponents. A system built to monitor and control, not to serve. Different countries, same structure. Political power without accountability, weak institutions, selective justice. This is not coincidence, it is systemic. In many Balkan societies, survival still depends on relationships. You don't solve problems through institutions. You solve them through people. A friend in the municipality, a cousin in the police, an uncle in the ministry. This creates a vicious cycle. Politicians distribute favors. Citizens return loyalty. Merit becomes irrelevant. Competence becomes optional, and corruption becomes transactional, not hidden, expected. When governments fail to deliver prosperity, they often offer something else: pride, historical grievance, external enemies. Nationalism becomes a shield. If the nation is under threat, then criticism becomes betrayal. If enemies surround us, then corruption becomes secondary. History becomes a distraction. While people argue about the past, elites steal in the present. There is one more powerful force at work, a force that drains societies of their future. The people who could change the system are leaving. The Balkans are one of the most historically dense regions on Earth. Empires rose here, battles were fought here, civilizations overlapped here. History is not just memory, it is identity, it is legitimacy, it is pride. But in such a region, something unusual happens. If a country lacks a powerful historical narrative, it risks being seen as weak, rootless, the black sheep. And when identity feels fragile, history becomes exaggerated, romanticized, weaponized. Political leaders understand this very well. When unemployment rises, they speak of ancient glory. When corruption scandals explode, they speak of national enemies. If you control the past, you influence the present. And if citizens are busy defending history, they are less focused on auditing power. This does not mean Balkan societies are uniquely obsessed with history. It means history has been one of the few stable sources of identity in unstable states. But when history replaces institutional reform, progress stalls. Across the Balkans, millions have left. Doctors, engineers, scientists, entrepreneurs, entire villages emptied. Young professionals choose Berlin over Belgrade, Vienna over Sarajevo, London over Athens. This is not just migration, it is structural erosion. The people most capable of reforming institutions are often the first to leave them. And when they leave, two things happen. First, the tax base shrinks. Second, the reform pressure weakens. Those who remain are often dependent on the state or entangled in patronage networks. The system sustains itself, not because it works, but because alternatives are gone. Corruption, in this context, becomes self-reinforcing. In many Balkan countries, media ownership is concentrated. Business magnates own television networks, political allies fund newspapers, journalists face lawsuits, or subtle pressure. When media is compromised, corruption becomes background noise. Scandals appear for a few days, then disappear. Accountability requires visibility. Without it, public outrage fades, and without outrage, reform loses urgency. But here is something important. Not all Balkan countries follow the same trajectory. Some have improved significantly. Romania strengthened its anti-corruption prosecution units. Croatia pursued high-level convictions. Slovenia developed stronger institutional stability. These examples show something crucial. Corruption is not destiny. It is institutional design. When courts are independent, corruption decreases. When procurement systems are digitalized, opportunities shrink. When public officials fear real consequences, behavior changes. The difference is not culture, it is enforcement. Research consistently shows 3 pillars matter most: independent judiciary, transparent public procurement, professional civil service recruitment. Not slogans, not ideology. Institutions. Stable rules applied equally. Corruption thrives in uncertainty. It dies in predictability. The Balkans are not broken because their people are flawed. They are shaped by history. Empires without representation, communism without accountability, war without closure, transitions without fairness. But history explains. It does not excuse. Every generation inherits systems, and every generation chooses whether to maintain them. The Balkans are rich in culture, in resilience, in intelligence, in creativity. They are not condemned to corruption, but reform requires something uncomfortable: trust in institutions, and institutions that deserve that trust. The question is not whether the Balkans are corrupt. The question is whether they are ready to rewrite the systems that made them so, and that story is still being written. If you found this documentary meaningful, consider supporting the channel. Like the video, subscribe for more deep, long-form documentaries, and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe corruption in the Balkans is slowly declining, or simply changing form? Your perspective matters. Thank you for watching.